It started without warning, no explosions, no headlines, no visible disaster. Just silence where factories used to hum. Overnight, Russia's industrial landscape went dark. From the outskirts of Moscow to the shipyards of the Far East, production lines stopped mid-shift. Conveyor belts froze, screens went black, and workers stood in disbelief as managers whispered the same phrase across every region: operations suspended. It felt like a power outage, said one engineer. But it wasn't electricity that went out, it was the country. By morning, the scale became impossible to disguise. Reports from regional administrations spoke of temporary closures, yet the language was identical across thousands of statements, a uniform script for something far larger than logistics. They always start with that word, temporary, said an economist in St. Petersburg. But everyone knows what it means. The cause, officially, was restructuring. Unofficially, the system had simply run out of parts, not mechanical, but economic. Years of sanctions, shrinking imports, and improvised substitutes had finally converged into stillness. The supply chain didn't break, said the economist. It dissolved. Inside the Kremlin, the reaction was muted. Officials appeared on television insisting that critical industries remain stable, but even their tone betrayed uncertainty. "They're reading stability from paper," noted a political observer in Moscow. "Not from reality." Ministries released vague statements about temporary technical adjustments, while quietly ordering regional governors to suppress panic. "They've been preparing for this moment for months," said an insider. "They just didn't expect it to arrive all at once." The collapse was not loud, it was procedural. Energy exports continued for a few days before slowing, then halting entirely in some regions. Steel plants idled, automotive factories stopped receiving components, and agricultural enterprises suspended operations until further notice. "This isn't sabotage or protest," said a Western analyst. "It's arithmetic. With limited imports, shrinking reserves, and growing debt, the economy simply could not breathe. It's like a heart that beats slower each month," he said. "Eventually, it just pauses." The social impact was immediate and invisible. Millions of workers received text messages confirming what they already feared: unpaid leave, indefinite suspension, restructuring. "No one said fired," explained a journalist in Ekaterinburg. "They just said stay home." Within hours, public transport thinned, queues at ATMs lengthened, and online searches for how to withdraw deposits early spiked. "People didn't panic," she continued. "They adapted, the way you do when the unexpected feels familiar." By noon, state television had shifted tone. Anchors reassured viewers that foreign disinformation campaigns were exaggerating the situation. "Our economy remains strong and self-sufficient," one presenter said with forced calm. But behind the polished rhetoric, signs of confusion grew. Interviews with ministers were rescheduled, press conferences postponed, and local administrations instructed to avoid negative phrasing. "It's not about information," said a former media executive. "It's about tempo. They want to slow perception down before panic speeds it up." In the provinces, where factories formed the backbone of entire towns, silence took on a physical weight. Workers gathered outside locked gates, waiting for instructions that never came. "They told us to check our emails," one man said. But the company email stopped working. Regional authorities deployed police not to disperse crowds, but to reassure them. "The state is present," a local official told reporters. Yet the presence felt hollow: uniforms without authority, announcements without power. "You can't manage collapse with optics," said a sociologist. But they're trying. Foreign markets reacted faster than Moscow. Within hours, global energy traders began recalculating prices, anticipating disruptions. The ruble fell sharply before stabilizing under artificial control, its value maintained by regulation, not trust. "You can hold a number," explained a London analyst, "but not a system." Western media called it the quiet crash. There were no riots, no bank runs, no visible crisis, only the steady disappearance of motion. "It's not 1998, the analyst said. "This time, it's slower, but deeper." Inside Russia, the public's response was eerily calm. "We've lived through so many shocks," said a teacher in Nizhny Novgorod. "People no longer react, they just wait." Telegram channels filled with speculation about emergency decrees, foreign intervention, and secret plans to nationalize remaining industries. None of it was confirmed, yet all of it felt plausible. "When the official story collapses," said a journalist, "rumor becomes the new government." By evening, one thing was clear: this was not a temporary glitch or a technical adjustment. It was a pause in motion so total that it revealed the structure beneath, a system built on momentum, not sustainability. They kept the illusion running for as long as the inertia lasted, said a Western diplomat. But now gravity is doing its work. The illusion of stability, the statistics, the speeches, the televised optimism, had finally met its limit. For those who want to understand how an economy collapses not with a bang but with a silence, how millions can lose their jobs without a single headline saying so, subscribing will help you follow what comes next, as Russia enters the most dangerous stage of any crisis, the moment after everyone realizes it has already happened. By the next morning, the illusion of control had begun to unravel. Officially, the government continued to describe the situation as temporary restructuring, yet the machinery of administration itself was showing cracks. Ministries issued overlapping directives, regional governors contradicted federal statements, banks waited for instructions that never arrived. The system is built on synchronization, explained a Moscow economist. Once messages stop arriving on time, everything freezes. Inside ministries, phones rang unanswered. It's not chaos yet, said a civil servant. It's waiting, and waiting is worse. Across the country, the same pattern repeated. Companies that had long survived on subsidies and state contracts quietly shut down, unable to pay wages or buy materials. No one declared bankruptcy, said a financial analyst. They just stopped answering calls. For a state accustomed to central coordination, the silence was more dangerous than protest. It's like a body losing its nervous system, he said. The limbs still move for a moment, but there's no signal from the head. In the cities, the first visible sign of crisis appeared not on the streets, but in the rhythm of daily life. Supermarkets stayed open but began reducing working hours. Pharmacies rationed imported medicines. Public transport delayed schedules due to maintenance. It's subtle, said a resident of St. Petersburg. Nothing has collapsed, but everything feels slower. The slowness, economists warn, is the symptom of paralysis. When nothing moves, you can't measure decline, said one. It looks calm, until it doesn't. On television, officials doubled down on reassurance. A government spokesperson insisted that essential services continue uninterrupted, reading from a paper whose edges shook slightly under studio lights. The next segment featured factory footage from an earlier broadcast, recycled without acknowledgement. They don't lie directly, said a media expert. They just play yesterday's truth. The technique, he explained, is designed to create delay, to keep the audience a day behind reality. If people are always reacting to the past, he said, they never reach panic. Inside elite circles, however, panic had already begun, quietly, discreetly, and without coordination. Wealthy businessmen transferred assets abroad, mid-level officials resigned for personal reasons. Flights to Dubai, Yerevan, and Istanbul filled overnight. They call it relocation, said a Kremlin insider. But everyone knows it's evacuation. The ruling class, long confident in its insulation, now faces the same uncertainty as the rest of the country. They believed the system could survive any failure, said the insider. They forgot it was the system itself that failed. Rumors spread through encrypted channels about emergency decrees, nationalization of key industries, suspension of foreign currency withdrawals, partial restrictions on movement. None were confirmed, but the speed with which they circulated reflected something deeper, the absence of trust. People no longer wait for truth, said a sociologist. They assemble it. The state, once master of the narrative, now competes with its own citizens for credibility. It's not rebellion, she explained. It's replacement. The banking sector became the next domino. Withdrawals increased, not dramatically, but consistently, a slow leak rather than a run. That's how systems die now, said a financial historian. Not through panic, but through patience. The government responded by limiting online transactions, for security reasons. In practice, it meant that salaries already delayed could no longer be transferred. They can't distribute money they don't have, said an insider at a state bank. But they can call it maintenance. Foreign investors, few that remained, began cutting ties. It's a controlled retreat, said a Western consultant. Everyone leaves without saying goodbye. Even China, Moscow's most visible trading partner, signaled unease by quietly suspending several logistics routes through Central Asia. They're not abandoning Russia, he clarified. They're insulating themselves from contagion. For ordinary citizens, the emotional reaction was strange, not outrage, but déjà vu. We've seen this movie, said a shop owner in Kazan. We just didn't expect the sequel so soon. The comparison to the 1990s appears often now, though experts insist this collapse is different. Back then, the system fell apart in public, said a historian. Now it's dissolving in silence. There are no protests, no strikes, no speeches, only absence. Absence of work, of answers, of movement. It's a passive catastrophe, she said. The kind that continues even when no one's watching. In provincial towns, people adapt instinctively. Barter replaces cash in small markets, families plant gardens early, local authorities quietly tolerate unlicensed trade. It's not resilience, explained a sociologist. It's memory. The population knows how to survive without a functioning state, it's been practiced before. They don't expect rescue, he added. They expect weather. Inside the Kremlin, discussions shift from damage control to narrative control. They can't fix it, said a senior aide. They can only define it. Words like transition, optimization, and realignment begin to appear in official documents. The collapse is renamed, reformatted, and repackaged as evolution. They're rewriting failure into progress, said a Western diplomat. And they might succeed, for a while. But even loyal bureaucrats admit privately that the tone has changed. They sound calm, one official whispered, but the calm is brittle. Outside the country, the reaction is cautious. Western leaders express concern for the humanitarian impact, while avoiding language that implies victory. No one wants to trigger instability, said a policy advisor in Berlin. Not in a country with nuclear weapons and no functioning payroll. International observers describe the moment as a controlled implosion, a collapse unfolding too slowly to be contained, too quietly to be reversed. Yet beneath that quiet lies something deeper than economic failure. The system's collapse is not only financial, it's psychological. The promise of continuity, the illusion that life could remain stable despite everything, has evaporated. People don't just lose jobs, said a sociologist. They lose the story that made those jobs make sense. The real crisis, experts warn, is not the factories that stopped, but the people who stopped believing. Once faith in inevitability dies, said a Russian historian, everything becomes negotiable, even loyalty. By the end of the first week, the silence had turned into murmurs, soft at first, then gathering weight. On social media, whispers replaced slogans. Who is responsible, became the question no broadcaster dared to ask aloud, but everyone repeated privately. People don't want change yet, said a sociologist in Moscow. They want someone to blame. In a country built on vertical power, responsibility always flows upward, and now, for the first time in years, the top began to look exposed. The government's initial response was denial by deflection. New narratives emerged overnight: sabotage, foreign interference, technical cyber disruptions. Each explanation contradicted the last, but that contradiction no longer mattered. They're not building truth, said a journalist. They're building fog. Confusion is safer than clarity. When no one knows what's real, no one knows where to aim their anger. Yet the fog was thinning faster than expected. Regional governors, long trained to echo the center's language, began issuing their own statements, subtle, cautious, but independent. They talk about local resilience, not national policy, noted a political scientist. That's the first step toward fragmentation. In the Urals, one governor openly criticized Moscow's slow communication, promising to protect regional stability through local initiatives. It was the kind of phrase that sounded loyal but implied distance. They're preparing to survive without orders, said an insider. In the Far East, regional administrators quietly reactivated emergency councils meant for natural disasters. It's not rebellion, said the same source. It's anticipation. The Kremlin noticed. Within days, internal memos warned against unauthorized policy coordination. The word coordination was key, it meant action without permission. They're afraid of the periphery remembering it exists, said a Moscow political consultant. For decades, the system had maintained unity through dependence. Regions relied on subsidies, subsidies relied on exports, and exports relied on global tolerance. Now, all three links had broken. Once the money stops, explained the consultant, the language stops too. In cities once considered loyal strongholds, small acts of disobedience began to appear. Transport unions delayed schedules, calling it equipment review. Hospital staff refused to work unpaid overtime, citing administrative oversight. None of this was protest in the traditional sense, it was withdrawal. They're not rising up, said a sociologist. They're opting out. The absence of resistance has become its own rebellion, a quiet refusal to keep pretending. Television channels, under pressure to maintain morale, shifted focus to cultural programming. Patriotic documentaries replaced economic briefings, reruns replaced news. It's a blackout in plain sight, remarked a journalist. Information hasn't disappeared, it's been tranquilized. But the internet, fragmented yet alive, filled the void. Telegram channels once known for gossip turned into local newsrooms. Citizens uploaded videos of idle factories, empty offices, darkened shopping centers. They're documenting decline as if it's heritage, said a media analyst. It's collective archiving of a state in slow motion. Inside elite circles, tension reached new levels of paranoia. Business owners, unsure whether to stay or flee, began liquidating assets at any price. It's capital flight disguised as logistics, said an economist. They're calling it redistribution. The few who stayed hoped loyalty would offer protection. But loyalty, he added, is no longer a currency anyone accepts. Intelligence reports suggest that parts of the security apparatus are quietly aligning with regional administrations rather than the federal center. They're hedging, said a Western analyst. They're preparing for whichever structure survives. The informational front, once the regime's strongest weapon, turned unstable. Competing narratives spread even within pro-government media. Some anchors spoke of temporary turbulence, others of historic transformation. The tone varied depending on proximity to power. In Moscow, they say stabilization, noted a media observer. In the provinces, they say adaptation. The difference is subtle but profound, one implies control, the other surrender. By midweek, the Ministry of Internal Affairs reported a rise in localized disturbances. The term was deliberately vague. It could mean protests, strikes, or people shouting at an empty office, said a human rights lawyer. Videos began surfacing, small groups gathered outside municipal buildings, demanding answers, holding homemade signs that read "Where is the pay?" And we built this country, now feed us. None of it was coordinated, but all of it was connected. The anger is spontaneous, the lawyer continued. And that makes it harder to suppress. Security forces responded with restraint. They can't afford violence, said a retired police officer. Not yet. Every baton, every arrest risks transforming an economic crisis into a political one. Instead, authorities rely on exhaustion, long waits, endless paperwork, silence. They're weaponizing bureaucracy, he said. People give up before they get answers. Within the Kremlin, emergency meetings stretch into the night. Advisors debate whether to announce a nationwide economic reorganization, a euphemism for partial collapse. They want to frame it as reform, said an insider. If you name a crisis correctly, people might mistake it for a plan. Yet even naming it requires confidence, and confidence is running out. The president still appears on television, the insider added, but each appearance feels shorter, more distant. He speaks in slogans, not sentences. Abroad, reactions remain cautious. Western officials call it an internal matter, though private briefings describe growing concern about instability near Russia's borders. A collapse of governance in a nuclear state is everyone's problem, said a diplomat in Brussels. But no one wants to touch it. The West watches as the Kremlin tries to project authority with fewer and fewer levers left to pull. It's like watching a building that's still standing, said another official, but already hollow. For ordinary Russians, the narrative of blame keeps shifting: foreign conspiracies, corrupt bureaucrats, lazy workers, even fate. Everyone's guilty, said a teacher. Which means no one is. The search for accountability dissolves into fatigue. It's not outrage anymore, she added. It's numbness. And that numbness, quiet, heavy, unresisting, is what keeps the collapse stable. For those who want to understand how systems disintegrate from the inside, not through revolution, but through erosion, subscribing will help you follow the next phase, where silence turns from symptom into strategy, and survival becomes the only ideology left. By the second week, the illusion of central control had given way to something older, almost medieval, a country divided by geography and inertia. Moscow still broadcast the image of unity, but the message no longer reached all corners. They're transmitting commands into a void, said a political scientist. The infrastructure of obedience has collapsed. Regional governors began to act as if they were alone, taking measures without approval and issuing decrees under the phrase, in coordination with federal authorities, a formula that now meant without them. In the south, local administrations ordered fuel reserves to be redirected to essential transport, ignoring Ministry of Energy instructions. In Siberia, governors froze payments to the central budget, citing emergency economic conditions. It's not rebellion, said a former Kremlin advisor. It's triage. The regions, long treated as extensions of the capital, were now behaving like separate organisms, conserving oxygen, cutting circulation, keeping themselves alive. They don't want independence, the advisor added. They just don't want to sink first. Inside the Kremlin, panic took a quieter form. Meetings multiplied, but decisions vanished. Committees produced reports no one read, decrees were drafted but never signed. It's a machine that still makes noise but no longer moves, said an official. The presidency, once omnipresent, had turned spectral. Public appearances became symbolic, brief visits to factories that no longer operated, speeches about stability recorded in empty halls. "The audience is imaginary now," said a Moscow journalist. "They're performing for history, not for the country." The security services, traditionally the final line of cohesion, began to fracture along regional and personal loyalties. "They're choosing sides quietly," explained a Western intelligence source. "No one wants to be the last to serve a disappearing state." Local commanders refused to relocate units, citing logistical difficulties. Police departments continued to function, but only where salaries still arrived. "The state still has guns," said the source, "but the payroll decides who holds them." For ordinary citizens, the absence of structure feels both liberating and terrifying. "No one gives orders," said a resident of Tver. "But that also means no one helps. Bureaucracy, once suffocating, has vanished in places entirely. Passports are issued late, pensions delayed indefinitely, municipal hotlines ring unanswered. In the vacuum, informal networks emerge, neighborhood committees, volunteer supply chains, barter systems. It's self-government without governance," said a sociologist. "They're rebuilding daily life from memory. Yet the memory itself is contradictory, part nostalgia, part survival instinct. We've lived through worse," people say, not as reassurance, but as resignation. Markets reflect the fragmentation before politics does. Currency rates now differ between regions, digital transactions often fail outside local networks. "The ruble still exists," said an economist in Ekaterinburg. "It's just regional now. Trade routes realign inward, cities begin to rely on local production, and the once centralized economy becomes archipelago-like, isolated, improvised, functional in pockets. This is the post-federal stage," the economist noted. "The map hasn't changed, but the system beneath it has. Abroad, the collapse looks deceptively orderly. There's no explosion, no coup, no clear end," said a diplomat in Geneva. "Just disintegration in slow motion." Foreign governments maintain cautious distance, issuing statements about stability and concern, while quietly preparing for spillover, refugee flows, unsecured materials, cyber disruptions. "No one wants to declare a failed state while it still has missiles," said the diplomat. "So they pretend it's reform." In Moscow, the elite grows restless. With capital frozen, assets seized, and foreign travel restricted, survival strategies diverge. One faction argues for a provisional technocratic government to restore confidence, another pushes for stronger military rule. "They don't care who wins," said a Kremlin staffer. "They just don't want to be on the losing side." Behind the scenes, discreet negotiations take place between oligarchs, regional leaders, and remnants of the security apparatus. "They're building parallel legitimacy," said a Western analyst. "Each group trying to prove it can hold the country together, or at least it's part of it." Information, once the regime's strongest weapon, has become its most dangerous liability. Propaganda networks continue broadcasting, but even loyal audiences sense dissonance. "The words haven't changed," said a media scholar, "but the tone has." Coverage of the economic crisis fades, replaced by endless cultural programming and patriotic retrospectives. "They're filling air, not minds," the scholar said. Meanwhile, local outlets, unofficial, often anonymous, gain influence, reporting shortages, protests, and regional decisions. "Authority is fracturing at the speed of the internet," a journalist remarked. "It's a mirror shattering one reflection at a time." For the military, the collapse presents a different challenge. Logistics lines strain as supplies slow and salaries vanish. "They still have weapons," said a defense analyst, "but they've lost purpose. Units once loyal to the center are now accountable to whoever feeds them. You can't command without fuel," he added. "You can't maintain loyalty without heat." Several border regions begin coordinating directly with neighboring countries for trade and humanitarian aid, bypassing Moscow entirely. "It's pragmatic treason," said the analyst. "No ideology, just survival." By now, even the word Russia feels heavier, less like a state, more like a memory still repeated out of habit. The symbols remain, the flag, the anthem, the language of unity. But behind them lies a growing recognition that unity itself has become optional. "You can't govern a story that people stop believing in," said a historian. "At some point, they start writing their own." International observers describe the situation as managed disintegration. But inside the country, it feels more like waiting for something unnamed. "It's not the end," said a factory worker. "It's the pause before something new begins." Yet no one knows who, or what, will start it. For those who want to follow how a modern state dissolves not in flames but in fragments, how a capital loses its gravity and regions remember their own, subscribing will keep you close to the moment when a country stops collapsing and starts dividing. By the third month, the collapse had stopped feeling like an event and started to resemble climate, constant, surrounding, inescapable. The word Russia still appeared on official seals, banknotes, and television broadcasts, but it no longer described a functioning system. "It's a sound without a structure," said a historian in Ekaterinburg. "The echo remains, but the building is gone." In what used to be a country, authority had become a mosaic, fragments of administration, commerce, and survival stitched together by habit rather than law. "They live as if the state still exists," said a sociologist. "Because stopping that belief feels more dangerous than the collapse itself." In the regions, life reorganized itself without permission. Local governments began issuing their own currencies, not as rebellion, but necessity. Some printed vouchers, others digitized them. "Money works as long as people agree it's worth something," explained an economist. "That's the last functioning social contract." Trade flowed along new routes: grain from Tatarstan to the Urals, diesel from Krasnoyarsk to the Far East, medical supplies from improvised workshops. The economy was smaller, but more alive than anyone predicted. "They've replaced hierarchy with barter," said a Western observer. "It's primitive, but stable." Moscow, or what remained of it, functioned as a symbol rather than a capital. Ministries occupied the same buildings, but their decisions no longer traveled beyond city limits. The bureaucracy continued to produce reports, but no one outside the ring road read them. "They're maintaining the illusion of control because the illusion itself is a resource," said a former civil servant. Power had become theatrical: meetings without purpose, decrees without enforcement, press conferences without journalists. "It's ritual governance," the official said. "A liturgy for a vanished state." Security forces, scattered and underfunded, became custodians of order in name only. Some units turned into regional militias, others merged with private enterprises. "They're defending whoever pays," explained a retired officer. In some territories, military command merged with local governance entirely, soldiers managing grain depots, officers running power stations. "It's feudal, but efficient," said a political analyst. "They don't call it separation. They call it responsibility." The information landscape followed the same pattern: decentralized, improvised, self-organizing. National television still broadcast, but few watched. Local channels filled the gap with weather, food prices, and short messages about missing relatives. "News has become geography," said a journalist. "You only know what's happening where you live." In the absence of a national narrative, people began inventing smaller ones. Communities printed their own newspapers, wrote local histories, and archived what they could before it disappeared. "They're documenting the end with the same discipline they once lived under it," the journalist said. Abroad, the world watched carefully, speaking in euphemisms. No one used the word collapse. Officially, Russia was undergoing structural transformation. "They want the fiction to hold," said a diplomat in Geneva. "Because if Russia ceases to exist on paper, every treaty that mentions it becomes a ghost. The fiction serves both sides: international institutions preserve their frameworks, and the fragments of the former state preserve their recognition. It's a shared illusion," the diplomat said. And illusions, once useful, are rarely replaced. Inside what was once the capital, the elite exists in two parallel worlds, one public, one private. Publicly, they still speak of national revival. Privately, they negotiate safe passage, assets, and guarantees with foreign intermediaries. "They're rearranging power for a country that no longer exists," said a Western intelligence officer. "It's bureaucratic necromancy. Some dream of restoration, others of escape. None talk about reform. They know they're managing remains," the officer said. "For ordinary citizens, the transition from statehood to survival has already completed. The absence of authority feels normal, improvisation feels routine. No one waits for orders anymore," said a teacher. "We just fix things ourselves." Schools remain open through community effort, electricity networks are repaired by volunteers, towns negotiate resource swaps with neighbors. "It's local socialism without ideology," said an academic. "People have rediscovered cooperation because there's nothing left to compete for." Yet even in fragmentation, identity persists. Flags still hang from administrative buildings, children still learn the anthem, and older generations still use the phrase "our country," though no one agrees where it begins or ends. "The word doesn't mean geography anymore," said the historian. "It means continuity. The story of Russia has survived its system. That's what nations do," he added quietly. "They dissolve into memory long before the paperwork catches up." The outside world has adapted to this new equilibrium, dealing with territories, not a nation. Energy contracts are renegotiated with governors, not ministers. Embassies operate through regional offices. It's post-sovereign diplomacy, said a policy advisor. The same map, new coordinates. The transformation is so gradual that it no longer shocks, it simply accumulates. Collapse isn't sudden anymore, the advisor observed. It's procedural. Still, somewhere in the background, the capital's voice continues, recorded statements about unity, pre-recorded celebrations of independence. It's the echo of a country that refuses to notice its own absence, said a broadcaster. Yet even the echo serves a purpose. It keeps the fragments connected through sound alone, a faint signal reminding them they were once part of something larger. Perhaps this is how modern states die, not in rebellion, not in flames, but in continuation. They don't disappear, said the historian. They just become smaller than their idea. The people, accustomed to endurance, will go on. The systems, once built to last forever, will fade into redundancy. And the name, Russia, will remain, printed on passports, stamped on warehouses, whispered in stories told to children who will never remember what it meant. For those who want to follow how power ends not with collapse but with diffusion, how nations dissolve into networks and history continues without conclusion, subscribing will keep you close to the quiet world that replaces empire, where survival becomes order, and memory becomes the last form of government.